mayoral offices, and they are demanding that New Hampshire's drug problem become part of the national conversation. Joining me now, Nicole Porter, Director of Advocacy for the Sentencing Project, Juan Manuel Benitez, who is political reporter and host of Pura Politica on New York One Noticias, Amy Goodman, host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, and Carl Hart, who serves on the National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse and is an associate professor of neuroscience and psychology at Columbia University. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to start, Amy, just with a political question. How in the world is it that for GOP candidates, drug abuse talked about in this way has become a top political issue?
You know, what's so interesting is it also goes to our political system. You have Iowa, you have New Hampshire. These are two of the whitest states in the country. It's so interesting that they are the ones that so often determine presidential politics. And when you have an issue that is plaguing all communities, for so long the Black community has dealt with this in pain and in silence, it becomes a major issue. And I think we're seeing this from Vermont, where the governor a few years ago devoted his entire State of the Union message to the issue of heroin abuse there. To New Hampshire and Iowa, it is mainstream politics now.
So that is fascinating to me. The story that you tell a little bit there is almost a miner's canary story, that there are communities of disprivilege who are experiencing these concerns, and then it shows up and becomes a political concern. But when it shows up this time, boy, is the rhetoric different.
Yes, but it's a good thing.
Okay.
The only problem here, my fear, is that they turn this into a false equation, because it's a really easy topic, like many others, to speak about really superficially. And we create a false equation. And we talk about one side of the equation, that it's the addiction. And we treat people like victims in this case. And then we try to solve it. And if there are victims and there's a perpetrator, there's a culprit. And now we try, and any attempt of criminal reform, it's going to go out of the window, because we're talking only on focusing on the victim, or we're going to try to find a culprit in the doctors, that maybe they are over-prescribing pills, or now they are taking away those pills, and these people are going to heroin. Or we're going to talk about Mexicans, and we've already heard about that. Mexicans bringing drugs to this country. Donald Trump, by the way, so many Latinos in this country really upset and angry that he's going to get a platform on Saturday Night Live tonight.
So that is so interesting to me, because, Nicole, I think for some folks who are in the midst of this kind of criminal justice reform moment, they're looking at this and saying, oh, great, this is the great bipartisan moment. We're going to shift to a conversation about drugs as a public health epidemiology problem instead of a criminalization problem. But maybe actually it's still just a way of having one set of victims and another group that still will get criminalized around it. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that's a possibility. So you have seen state reforms, like Amy said, and in addition to Vermont and New Hampshire, states like Kentucky and Oklahoma expanded treatment for people with heroin addiction. But in those
but Kentucky is also a little bit like you could still feel free to go to jail.
Sure,
I mean, they're not quite
right. But then I was going to say, in the same year, part of the same comprehensive measures where they addressed use of heroin, they enhanced penalties for traffickers and people involved in other parts of the drug trade. Specifically, this dichotomy between users and victims, or perpetrators and people who are demonized because they sell drugs.
Now, Carl, you're always one of my favorite people to have at the table in these kinds of conversations, because you tend to enter in and just flip the whole script. I know you actually have some reservations about the idea that this epidemic even exists in that way.
I'm one of your favorite people, and you demoted me in the introduction. I'm not an associate professor, I'm a professor.
Oh, yes, sir. I did not do that, but I will correct that at this moment. Yes, sir, you are a professor.
No, but you raise an important point. I mean, actually, everybody around the table are making really good points. The thing that I just like people to understand is that the vast majority of the people who use heroin or prescription opioids don't need treatment. They don't need jail either. So we're in this frame of drug abuse, and most of the people who use these drugs don't need either of those.
You got to explain that a little bit for folks, because I think most folks, if they hear you're using heroin, think you should stop that.
Yeah, they do. I mean, just like when people drive their car too fast, you should stop that. But that doesn't mean you should go to treatment for that or have some sort of law enforcement criminal justice sentence as a result. So people do things that that we don't necessarily approve of, and using heroin is one. And they go to work and they take care of their family. People use prescription opioids in ways that are different from their prescriber. Like me, I had, for example, dental pain, but I had some opiates left over or something, and I may use them to sleep or something. But that's abuse. That's what people would. But by the same token, I take care of my family. I go to work. I do all of these things. This is how Americans use these things, and so we have to be careful in terms of how we are framing this whole issue. I mean,
so stick with me because I want to dig into that, but also a bunch of other ideas when we come back. Because for me, there's also an existential question about why Americans do, if there is an increase in drug use, why do we need to be high? Kind of what's going on? What is our sadness or our distress as a nation that we're feeling the need to medicate from? That and the political rhetoric when we come back. Oval Office, his first such address.
This is crack cocaine, seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones, and it's murdering our children. Let there be no mistake. This stuff is poison.
Now, of course, that drug buy in the park near the White House was staged just for this purpose, but that's neither here nor there. In this address, President Bush laid out his plan to fight crack, the war on drugs, and he placed the blame first and foremost on drug users.
Our most serious problem today is cocaine, and in particular, crack. Who's responsible? Let me tell you straight out. Everyone who uses drugs, everyone who sells drugs, and everyone who looks the other way.
Contrast that message with how today's presidential contenders, Republican presidential contenders, describe drug users.
There but for the grace of God go I. It can happen to anyone. And so we need to start treating people in this country, not jailing them. We need to give them the tools they need to recover, because every life is precious. Every life is an individual gift from God. And we have to stop judging and start giving them the tools they need to get better.
So what in the world has changed? I mean, that is very different discourse across that time.
Well, I think it's the story of how people are using heroin today. There is general consensus that because the users are white, the response is more humane. And it follows a pattern of responding to crime problems in the U.S. overall. When the users or the people assumed to be committing the crime are black or people of color, there's a tendency to demonize and dehumanize. When the users or people perpetuating the crime tend to be white, there is a tendency to be more curious. And compare the current response to the to the heroin epidemic to how we responded to crack in the 80s, but you can even go back farther to how marijuana was responded to in the 1930s, and the law enforcement response when it was assumed that marijuana use was in the racy part of towns, as opposed to in the 1960s when there was a more curious response when white college students were using it in their dorm rooms and on their college campuses.
And yet, the one part of the curiosity that I do want to bring back, because I feel like, part of what Carl's saying about our presumptions that if one is using drugs, then it is necessarily something one must get treatment for and all these other kinds of things. But I do feel like we're not sufficiently curious about why people use. I feel like when communities of color, when poor communities have drug problems, we presume we know it's because they're poor and they're in desperate circumstances. But I would really like to know why, often privileged white Americans are making use of drugs that allow them to kind of escape. What is it that we're escaping from as a country?
Well, I don't know if people are escaping necessarily. Think about your own alcohol use. Think about other people's alcohol use when you go to these boring-ass receptions that I have to go to often. And people
It just makes the world more interesting.
It makes it more interesting, and not only that, it makes people more tolerable in some cases. And so when we think about all of these psychoactive drugs, they're all interacting with brain chemicals, chemicals in the brain in similar ways. And so the use of heroin is not so different from the use of alcohol, but that's a socio-political construction that we have all done. And so when we think about the socio-political construction about drugs, please remember, drug policy is just an extension of all policies in this country. Drug policy is used in a way to further marginalized groups. That's how it's been used. And it's not different from other policies. It's not unique. But please understand, the body does not see heroin like different from OxyContin or even different from things like alcohol. That's us constructing this, not the body.
So that is incredibly provocative. So I want to stick on this, because when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about that policy framework that you're talking about. Bring both of you guys in on presidential candidate Hillary Clinton's new plan to address these issues. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton released a new proposal for criminal justice reform yesterday, addressing in particular mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. Now, Clinton didn't call for abolishing mandatory minimums entirely, but she did propose cutting such sentences in half for nonviolent drug offenses and making those cuts retroactive, as long as the court approves. And she would also make the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which abolished the 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession of crack, apply retroactively for nonviolent offenders. So, I mean, Carl's put this kind of provocative idea on the table about our physical responses to any of a set of things, from caffeine to wine to heroin, right? But that what is indisputable is that our responses, not our physiological responses, but our political responses, are quite different. And here we have a candidate saying, I'm going to start trying to roll some of this back.
Yeah, I don't think how successful that's going to be, because if the political discourse is dominated now by the fact that the Republican candidates are talking about people using drugs as victims, then we're going to try to criminalize the other side of the equation. So I don't think we're going to be that successful. And remember, when we try to be more lenient with someone, as soon as they screw up once, then we go back, we roll back everything. And we've seen that recently here in New York City also.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not a small point, that there is still relative courage required for an American lawmaker to step out and say, let's decriminalize, or let's at least roll it back, especially when you look at what was the sentencing disparity. It is now down to 18-1 under President Obama, but 18-1 is still enormous, right? It's not the 100-1, but it's still enormous. If crack sort of picks back up again, you do have that political problem reemerging.
I mean, we have to look at the actual factual results of treatment. And I was just moderating a panel where the former mayor of Vancouver was, who was also happened to be a coroner before he was mayor. He started to see the number of people who died, and he said, we have to do something about this. In Vancouver, they have the only legal injection clinic, I think it's in North America, where people can shoot up with heroin legally. The police at first were against it. Now they're for it. They're bringing people there. You reduce Hep C, you reduce HIV. It's also true in Frankfurt, Germany. They're seeing this in many different places. We need courageous politicians who are actually looking at who's affected, what can help our communities the most, not to mention bringing down crime.
So when you say the crime, I want to pop back for a minute, back to 1986, because I do want to point out that some of this intervention, this criminal justice intervention, was actually initially welcomed by communities. This is kind of an amazing little piece of historical footage here.
We don't need just say no. The Take Back the Streets demonstrations in the Bronx parallel the efforts of many other protest groups that have cropped up across the country.
In Miami, at the request of various church and civic groups, police added special anti-crack motorcycle patrols. In Texas, citizens marched for miles for a drug-free Corpus Christi. The march was aimed at school children. In Baltimore, it was a religious vigil, a plea for peace among street gangs involved in drug-related violence. Many police officials across the country said they're amazed at the recent citizen response to the crack epidemic, that public support will back up their efforts to combat the drug problem.
In this moment, to see communities saying, please, police, come in, is stunning, because, of course, how that turned out is a little different maybe than what people thought in '86.
Right, and it's dismaying to see footage like that. I think what's important to remember is that those communities had a false choice of only relying on law enforcement or only calling in the police. I think if there were more intentional conversations guided by political elites, guided by other influencers, and communities were offered other choices, expanding early childhood education, bringing in programs targeted to at-risk youth, providing therapeutic opportunities for people in need of trauma care, then those choices could have been broader than just relying on arrest, just relying on incarceration, and driving the policies that have resulted in mass incarceration.
It's also an interesting point, as we go, that you know, your point, people are dying, we must do something about it. When we think about guns and handguns, and particularly that the #1 way in which people die from handguns is through suicide, and yet we haven't quite had that same policy response as a country. We must do something about it. Thank you to Carl Hart. The rest of my guests are sticking around. I'm sorry, Professor Carl Hart. The rest of my